Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 33 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. This night is the final chapter in Matthew, chapter 28, with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Rabbi, it's so good to have you again. How are you?
It's great to be here, William.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I can't believe it. We actually finally made it through Matthew.
It is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's definitely a good marker for sure.
It's nice to finish something.
Yes, indeed. Man, I'm excited. I really am. This is going to be good. So what's on your mind anyway as we come to the conclusion of our beloved Matashahu, if you will?
I was wondering if I'm never a Christian. I was wondering if Christians do what Jews do when they finish a book. You know, it's common that when Jews study, let's say, a book of the Talmud, so when they finish, they make a siyum, which is basically a celebration. People get together and they'll have food and people will speak and sing. They have a bit of a party. And, I was just wondering if in the Christian world, people make a celebration when they finish studying a book of the New Testament or the whole thing. But I'm not saying we're going to make a party tonight. But we've been working on this for probably like at least 7 or 8 months.
Yeah, well, we've got this is episode number 33, so 33 weeks worth.
Okay, so we'll be bringing it home tonight.
Yes, we will. Time for the Grand Slam, and then we'll decide where we're going to go from here.
And I think, we still have to work out what we'll be doing after Matthew, but I think because the resurrection story is, number one, it's so central to Christianity and so central to the New Testament, so I'm going to try and squeeze in tonight a bit more than just Matthew. We're going to try and take in the whole package on this issue of the resurrection. And first of all, I think it's just important to set the stage because we've been looking so far at the life of Jesus, and what we've seen is that, at least according to the approach we've been taking, is that Jesus did see himself, and his followers saw him as the Messiah, pretty much in the sense that Jewish people understood the concept of the Messiah. When you go through the Hebrew scriptures, so we see that the Messiah is, first of all, not someone that's disconnected from the people of Israel. When you go through the whole picture of what the Messiah is in Judaism, the Messiah is the king of a people. He's the king of the nation. And we know there's no king without a nation. So, it's important to remember that, in the biblical concept, the Jewish biblical concept, the Messiah is, not some, extraterrestrial being that comes down from outer space that has no connection to a people or a nation. The biblical Messiah, has a role that is in conjunction with the people he's going to be leading. So just to summarize very quickly, what you see when you go through the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, is that we're told, that the entire program of the Messiah is one that works through the nation of Israel as God's instrument to really bring the world to its perfection. And so the way the Bible describes it is that one day the Jewish nation as a people are going to embrace their mission. That's been the story of our history, is that as a nation, we never fully got our act together. We've had what we always call a remnant of Jews, a number of Jews who've been loyal to God and to the Torah. But what the scriptures predict is that one day the whole nation will return to God and will re-embrace the Torah. And we see that in the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy. We see it in chapter 59 of Isaiah, where we're told that at some point in the future, the people of Israel are going to turn away from sin and turn back to God. And that really ignites the entire chain of what will take place afterwards, meaning what the Bible tells us is that once the Jewish people turn towards God, God will then return us to our homeland. And so what the scriptures speak about repeatedly in dozens of passages is that the Jewish nation will return to live in their ancestral homeland, to the land of Israel. The exile will end. We'll come back to the land of Israel. The scriptures tell us that we're going to live there in peace and that we're going to come to see our temple rebuilt. And we're told that the culmination of this will be that the nations of the world are going to really come to the nation of Israel as spiritual teachers. Isaiah chapter 60 says that the nations will come to walk by our light. And Zechariah says that 10 people from every nation will grab hold of a Jew, say, we want to follow you, we've heard God is with you. And so that mission that God gave us originally, as God told Abraham, through your people, the whole world is going to be blessed. And God told us at Mount Sinai that we're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And through Isaiah, we're told we're supposed to be a light to the nations. And so the Bible says it's going to happen. There's going to be a time when the Jewish people will be unified and loyal to serve God and then become God's representatives to the world. And the world is going to embrace the Jewish people. We're told that the world will now begin to walk in our light. And what will happen is the knowledge of God will spread to the entire world. That's basically one of the main teachings of the Bible about the Messianic age, is that every human being will come to have a knowledge of God. The Bible, we call that, the rabbinic literature is called the kingdom of God, Malchut Shamayim. We see, for example, in Zechariah chapter 14, we're told in that day, God will be one and his name will be one. And then when the knowledge of God spreads to the entire world, so we know that every person will see themselves as a brother and sister, children of one God, and then we'll see that universal peace spreads to the entire world. That's chapter 11 in Isaiah. And so that was really Jesus's mission. That was what Jesus thought he was coming to do. That was the main thing that Jesus said over and over again during his ministry, is that the kingdom of God is at hand. That was the major teaching of his predecessor, John the Baptizer. And they both believed that if people will return to God and repent, it could basically bring about this messianic age, which is exactly what the Bible taught and what Judaism believes. And, we see that was his belief. We see that was the expectation of his followers. We'll see later on that there's a scene where two of his followers are walking very sadly after the crucifixion because they weren't expecting that. They were expecting triumph, and they ended up, encountering humiliation and defeat. So two of his followers are walking after the crucifixion in Jerusalem, and they meet someone. In the story in Luke, they're meeting Jesus. They don't know it's him. They don't recognize him, but they say to him, we were hoping that Jesus was going to redeem Israel. They expressed what their hope and expectation was. Their expectation was that that's exactly what they signed on for. Their understanding was that if Jesus was the Messiah, he was going to redeem Israel, and that would basically lead to the redemption of the whole world. So that didn't work out. And we know that as a result of that, many of his followers fled. They probably were afraid that they'd be next. And many of them probably went back home to the Galilee, and just tried to get their lives back together. But we know that many of the followers stayed in Jerusalem, and they were in shock. They were basically shell-shocked. They were very confused. And we know that psychologically, the mechanism that set in was called cognitive dissonance. This is an important psychological dynamic to understand. Leon Festinger was a famous psychologist who wrote a book that's really important to read called When Prophecy Fails. And he describes, several movements where people believe something and then the belief comes crashing down and really is disconfirmed. It's disproven. And the cognitive dissonance theory says that when people have their belief basically destroyed in their face, they will very frequently not walk away from their belief. They'll try to somehow salvage it by tweaking or coming up with a fudge factor, coming up with some rationalization. And so we find that the disciples of Jesus that are in Jerusalem are confused, they're upset, they're shocked, they didn't expect Jesus to be killed. And that state of cognitive dissonance apparently led some of them, at least some of them, to believe that Jesus appeared to them, that they had seen Jesus, that Jesus appeared to them. And this idea was able to help them maintain their belief that Jesus really was the Messiah. This sort of was giving them a sign that, there is still hope, that Jesus has come back from the dead, and things are not all lost. And this idea of the resurrection of Jesus became really a central feature in the way early Christianity really gave a makeover to the biblical idea of the Messiah. They began to sort of redefine the concept of the Messiah, and the resurrection played an important part. And this is a very important thing to understand, that what shifted in this new definition, this new idea of the Messiah, was that the original concept of the Messiah was really a horizontal one, where the Messiah works with the Jewish people as the leader, the king of the Jewish people. They work through history to bring about a utopian world. And that didn't happen. So in this new vision of the Messiah, it's not any longer a horizontal vision, but it's now a vertical vision that's not connected to the fate of a people, a nation, but it's really focused more on the fate of the individual believer in the Messiah. And so what happens is the concept of Messiah switches from this horizontal concept that works through history with a nation to change the world. And now what happens is it's a vertical concept that works in the lives of those people who will believe in the Messiah. Again, there was nothing in the Jewish scriptures that had really painted a picture like this. And there were two major features to this new concept of the messianic idea. One is that believing in the Messiah will lead to the forgiveness of one's sins. And the second is that by Jesus allegedly being resurrected and conquering death, so now the believer in Jesus has a promise of eternal life for themselves. This idea of the resurrection became very clearly the central event in Christian history, meaning that of all the things that happen in Christian history, it's not so much the birth of Jesus or any of the miracles of Jesus. Really, the central event in the Christian story really became the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll see when we study the book of Corinthians that Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 17, that if Jesus had not been resurrected, he tells the Corinthians, then your faith is in vain. Because as Christian theologians paint it, without the resurrection, there's no atonement, there's no forgiveness, there's no eternal life, there's really nothing. And so all of Christianity, which is this breakaway from Jewish ideas, really hangs, it sort of suspends from the resurrection. So what we'd like to try to do tonight is, discuss this idea, and especially how it ties into the New Testament, and to see really how it developed and how we can understand it. One of the things that we have to understand is that when we ask the question, what is the evidence, the historical evidence that there was a resurrection of Jesus? So it's important to just bear in mind that the only evidence, if you want to call it that, the only evidence that we have would be the Christian Bible, the testimony of the evangelists and Paul. the gospel writers and Paul. And so what we're going to have to try and think about is, and this is really good for us in terms of summing up the book of Matthew, how credible are these reports? We have to try to understand, what are these reports of the resurrection and how credible are they? So let's just again sort of summarize what we know about the four Gospels, and it includes what we're just finishing now, the Gospel of Matthew. When you open up a Christian Bible, it begins with these four biographies: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John were actually part of Jesus's inner circle. And Luke and Mark really were not part of Jesus' inner circle, but they became associated with it pretty early on. What's important to understand is that even though the New Testament tries to give the impression, that's the impression you get when you open it up, is that these four accounts, these four biographies, are written by these four men, by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, who were either part of Jesus' inner circle or they joined very soon after the start of the movement. But that's not true. When you look at the manuscripts of the Greek Testament, the Greek manuscripts, they don't mention any authors. It doesn't say in the Greek manuscripts, this is the gospel that was written by Matthew.
Right.
It never mentions the names. The documents are written anonymously. And it's actually very, very difficult to imagine that those four men who were around at the time of Jesus, they wrote these documents for two reasons, really, at least two reasons. Number one, we know that the followers of Jesus were pretty simple Galilean, fishermen. They were not. Some of them were told were illiterate, and they were Aramaic-speaking Jews. And the Gospels are written in a pretty literary Greek. So that's one problem. How do you get these Aramaic-speaking simple Jews to write something in a very high-class literary Greek? And the second problem is that virtually all scholars date these sources, these documents, to the years 70 to about 100. Meaning that these documents were written between 40 and 70 years after the crucifixion. So I don't know exactly how old they would have been, these people, when they were part of Jesus' movement. I don't picture them as 13-year-old boys.
Right.
And I don't imagine they were 65-year-old retirees. So let's be generous and imagine they were 20 years old, 25 years old when they were following Jesus. So that would mean that these books were written at people between the ages of 65 and 95. It doesn't really make much sense why they would wait so long to write these documents. Did they even expect to live that long? So basically what happened was these were documents written anonymously, and it only became part of church tradition to give it more credibility, to give them more credibility by associating these documents with people who lived at the time of Jesus. But this is certainly not the case. So one thing we have to bear in mind when thinking about the gospel accounts of the resurrection is they were not eyewitness testimony. They were not even written, at the time of the events. They were written quite a bit later, 40 to 70 years later. Another thing just to think about is that there's no corroboration, meaning outside the New Testament, there isn't any other independent historical sources that speak about the resurrection of Jesus. Actually, they don't speak about almost anything about the life of Jesus. So that's really important to remember, that we're not reading testimony that really is ever corroborated. Another problem is that these are not historians or journalists that are writing the Gospels. These are people that were fervent believers in Jesus, and as the writer of John says, in chapter 20, verse 31, he says, I'm writing this gospel in order to convince people to believe in Jesus. So he's really saying he has an agenda, meaning that he's there as a salesperson. He's an evangelist. He's writing really something that's more sales material or propaganda than what might be considered objective historical record keeping. And the other gospel writers had the exact same agenda. Now, even if we look at the Gospels themselves, one of the things that is troubling in terms of the credibility of the story is that we see that as the stories are reported of the resurrection, you see that even the followers of Jesus are pretty skeptical, which is not encouraging if you want to really embrace this idea that Jesus literally came back from the dead. For example, we see in the Gospel of John that when the women come to the tomb and they see that it's empty, this is Mary, I believe, Mary Magdalene. So she doesn't assume that Jesus rose from the dead. Right here, she comes to the tomb, it's empty. And what John says is that her assumption, and this is what she tells the disciples, she assumed that someone moved the body. So here you have someone that was a follower of Jesus, and you would think would be hoping that Jesus would have been resurrected, but when she sees the tomb that's empty, doesn't jump to the conclusion that Jesus was resurrected. Then we see that when in the four Gospels, all of them, when the women come back from the empty tomb and they report, that someone told them that Jesus was risen and that the tomb is empty. So we see in Mark chapter 16, verses 11 to 13, and in Luke chapter 24, verse 11, and in John chapter 20, verse 25, that the disciples didn't believe these reports. They just thought the women were talking nonsense. And then we see in a number of stories that when Jesus supposedly appears to his disciples, they don't recognize him. So in Luke chapter 24, verse 16, Jesus appears to two of his disciples. That's a story I mentioned earlier. And they don't recognize him. They don't know that it's Jesus that has appeared to them. A little bit later in that chapter of Luke, verses 36 to 37, Jesus appears to his 11 disciples, the ones that are left over after Judas Iscariot committed suicide, and they're startled, and they assume that they're just seeing some kind of a spirit. And then in John chapter 20, verse 14, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus but doesn't recognize him. She thinks it's the gardener. And then later on in chapter 21, verse 4 of John, Jesus appears to 7 of his disciples on the beach, and they don't recognize him. And then we'll see here in Matthew, in this chapter we're looking at tonight, that when Jesus appears to his disciples on top of the mountain in the Galilee, so it says that they worshipped him, but many of them doubted. Or some texts say some of them doubted, but it shows a lack of clarity in all of these stories, where even the direct followers of Jesus seem to be a little bit skeptical. Now, the truth is that there was a chance for the resurrection story to have secured an anchor of credibility, meaning that there was one thing that could have really made the story more credible. And we remember back in Matthew chapter 12 that the Jewish leaders asked Jesus for a sign. And he gets a bit snarky with them and says, well, this evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but he says the only sign that they're going to get is the sign of Jonah. And he says that just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights and then emerged, so too, he says, so shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he will emerge. So here he's basically saying to the Jewish leaders, you want a sign that I am who I say that I am? He said, I'll appear after I die. I'm going to be buried for 3 days and I'm going to come out. But Jesus never appears to these Jewish leaders. Mm-hmm. He never comes to the Sanhedrin. he only appears to those people who were his followers. And so, what you see here is something similar to the Book of Mormon. We know that in Mormonism, Joseph Smith claimed that the angel Moroni showed him these golden plates from which Joseph Smith was able to translate the Book of Mormon. And if you get any Book of Mormon that was printed since 1830, it has in the very beginning of the book the testimony of, I believe, the 3 and then the testimony of the 8. So I think there are 11 people who testify that they saw these golden plates. Now, who are these 11 people? Just happens to be that they are either relatives or close associates of Joseph Smith. Now, what would have given the story more credibility would have been if Joseph Smith showed up at the Smithsonian Institute or went to some, serious museum or went to the largest newspaper of his day and showed these golden plates to some outsider who could then vouch for the credibility of the story. But it's sort of convenient where the witnesses, that he shows the plates to all happen to be members of his inner circle. And so the same thing, that when you read the gospel accounts, all the appearances that Jesus makes are basically to his followers. And he had promised that he would really show himself to the Jewish leaders, which he never did. It reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who was a Jewish fellow that got caught up in a Messianic synagogue for a number of years. And while he was there was a woman that really had a crush on him. And she came to him one night and says, "Larry, the Lord spoke to me and revealed to me that we're to be married." And my friend got very upset. He was not interested in this person as a potential marriage partner. So he went to the pastor, and the pastor said, "Look, Larry, when the Lord speaks to you and tells you that you're supposed to marry the girl, then we'll worry about it. But if he's only appearing to her, I wouldn't take it too seriously."
Right.
So, that's one place I believe that the New Testament could have established some credibility for the resurrection story. One of the great challenges, of course, to the credibility of the resurrection story is the incredible inconsistencies that we'll find when you go through the different accounts. There are so many. A friend of mine, Michael Alter, just wrote a 850-page book, Critical Inquiry on the Resurrection. It's the first of 2 volumes, actually. There's going to be a second volume coming out in the near future. But the first volume, 850 pages, goes through many, many, many inconsistencies. I'll just share a few just to clarify what we're talking about here. First of all, if we go back a chapter, so that would mean in Matthew 27, in Mark 15, in Luke 23, and in Mark 14, and in Matthew 27, and in Luke 23, and in John 19, you have the crucifixion stories. And even there, comparing the stories, there are tremendous discrepancies and inconsistencies between the accounts. But in the resurrection accounts, you find the same thing. So, for example, who first came to the tomb of Jesus on Sunday morning? So the Gospel of Mark reports that it was 3 women. It was Mary Magdalene, it was Mary, the mother of Jesus, and a woman named Salome. 3 different women. In Matthew, in this chapter we're studying tonight, chapter 28 of Matthew, it just says it was 2 women, Mary Magdalene and another woman named Mary. Luke chapter 24 says it was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Joanna, and a bunch of other women. And then in John chapter 20, it just says that Mary Magdalene alone came to the tomb. So you have 4 different stories about what happened on Sunday morning. When these women come to the tomb, so do they find the tomb closed? Was it blocked by a stone? Or had the stone already been removed? So in Mark and in Luke and in John, you see that the stone has already been moved away when the women show up. But in Matthew, the stone is still there. And Matthew tells us that there's a big earthquake, and an angel comes, and the stone is rolled away. Then, who do the women first see when they come to the tomb? So in Mark, all they see is a young man who's sitting inside the tomb. In Matthew, they see an angel sitting on the rock outside the tomb. In Luke, they see two men standing inside the tomb. And in John, they don't see anything. Mary doesn't see anything when she first comes to the tomb. What happens is when she later returns with two disciples, she sees two angels. Then a serious distinct difference is, what are the women first told at the tomb? Meaning, when these women have this experience with whoever they see at the tomb, what message are they given? So in both Mark and in Matthew, they're told that Jesus has risen and that he's going to meet the disciples in the Galilee. In Luke, it's interesting that they're told nothing about going to the Galilee, but they're given specific instructions to stay in Jerusalem and remain in Jerusalem. So I'm not going to go through all the differences, but I just wanted to point out that, you know, some people look at these inconsistencies as sort of a gotcha kind of thing, but I don't think that's the important realization to make. I think that what we're going to see as we go through the story tonight is that these inconsistencies illustrate the reality. These stories were very fluid. Don't forget, when the gospel writers wrote them between 40 and 70 years after the events, again, they were not eyewitnesses. And they were basically composing their version, their narrative of stories that had been oral reports that were floating around for a long time. And these reports did not stay static. They changed, they developed, they grew. We're going to see how this happened tonight. And I believe that's why, because these stories were so fluid and they were developing over the course of time, that in the gospel accounts, we do find that they are inconsistent. One of the things that Christian apologists will often say is that, well, you shouldn't be surprised by the fact that these stories are inconsistent, because they say it's similar to a car accident. If you have a car accident where four people see a crash and they're testifying about what happened, they won't all tell exactly the same story. There'll be variations between how they report the accident. The problem with this analogy is twofold. Number one, we already know that none of the gospel writers were eyewitnesses. So the idea of eyewitness testimony being slightly different is true for eyewitnesses, but it doesn't apply to people who are not eyewitnesses. And secondly, the differences between eyewitnesses will account for things like, you know, was the car dark gray or light gray? That kind of difference people might report differently. But what you're not going to hear is differences between people saying that, you know, there were two cars that crashed, or a witness saying, well, it was a car crashing into a big truck. That kind of difference you're not going to get in the reporting of an accident between four different people. So even if they're eyewitnesses, they're not going to disagree about whether they were told that the disciples should go to the Galilee or stay in Jerusalem. That's not a difference of perspective. Or if the crucifixion took place on Passover or on the day before Passover, you know, or was it 9 o'clock he was crucified or noon? Those are not differences of perspective. Those are just literally things that can't be explained away so easily. So again, just bear in mind that what we're going to try to show tonight is how these stories developed over time. And in order to do that, I wanted to look at the first witness to the resurrection. Many people don't realize that the letters of Paul, although they come after the Gospels in the Christian Bible, the letters of Paul are actually written first, meaning that the earliest documents in the Christian Bible are not the Gospels, which appear first in the book, but the letters of Paul. Paul is writing his letters in the mid-50s, and the earliest gospel is written around the year 70. So Paul is about 15 years, he writes his letters, about 15 years before the first gospel is written. So I think that the earlier the source, I believe it should have even more credibility than a source that's written much, much, much later.
Yeah, agreed.
So when we look at what Paul writes, it's very, very interesting. Paul claims that Jesus appeared to him. That's what Paul writes, that Jesus appeared to him. But does that prove that Jesus was bodily resurrected? Meaning that when Paul says that Jesus appeared to him, does that mean that Jesus' body sort of was revivified, came back to life, and Paul saw the risen, physical, reconstituted, body of Jesus with all his wounds healed? We know that that's not what Paul reported. Paul is right, but the vision that Paul had of Jesus is written about 3 times in the book of Acts, in chapter 9, in chapter 22, and in chapter 26 of Acts. We believe it was written by Luke. So we're told basically what happened when Paul has his vision of Jesus. We're told that a bright, very bright light flashes from heaven. It knocks Paul to the ground, and Paul hears a voice, which he believes is the voice of Jesus, but he sees nothing. He doesn't see anything. And that's the major revelation of Jesus to Paul. It's very clear that what Paul is having is what we call a visionary experience. He's not seeing Jesus actually walking, meaning that if you were at that scene when this happened and you had a iPhone and you snap pictures, you wouldn't see Jesus, right? It wouldn't be the kind of thing that would show up on film. He has a personal, spiritual, visionary experience. And this is very consistent with Paul's teaching on the manner of resurrection, meaning that Paul discusses what does it mean to be resurrected? How does resurrection work? And Paul very clearly says that resurrection is not the resuscitation of a dead body. Paul says it's not that a person dies and they arise with their old body. Paul finds that to be repulsive. And Paul says that in resurrection, a person does not get their old body back in shape, but they're given a new, glorious spiritual body. That's how Paul sees resurrection. And he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 50, that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. So he sees resurrection in general as something that's spiritual, not physical. And so what we see is that Paul has a visionary experience of Jesus, and that's very similar to many other such visionary experiences. If you go back to Matthew chapter 17, which we did a number of weeks ago, you had there the transfiguration story, where Jesus takes to the top of a high mountain Peter and James and John. And we're told that at the top of the mountain, they see Moses and Elijah. Now, are we to imagine that Moses was resurrected from the dead at that point, and his body came back to life, and he appeared to them, and they could have shook his hand? And if there was a camera, it would have showed up on film? And if that's what happened to Moses afterward? Did he hang around? Did he go back to, it's very clear that what happens on the top of that mountain is that Peter and James and John are having a visionary experience. Or in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is being martyred, he's being killed. So we're told in verses 55 to 56 that Peter basically intently stared into the heaven, and he saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. That's what Stephen is seeing. He's seeing God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Now, are we to assume that he saw a physical body of Jesus, flesh and blood, flesh and bones, standing there at the right hand of God? Or is Stephen having a visionary experience? I, I have to tell you that I over the years, I think I've met probably at least 20 people, who've told me to my face that Jesus appeared to them, that they saw Jesus and Jesus spoke to them. I take them at their word. I don't assume that they're on drugs, but I don't assume that if I was in the room, I would have seen Jesus as well. I think that these are people that have what they believe to be a visionary experience of Jesus. They believe that Jesus has appeared to them. In the Catholic Church, there have been over the centuries hundreds of reports of both individuals and groups of people who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. These are called the Marian apparitions, but the Catholic Church has an entire body called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that investigates these claims, and they have validated many of them. Now, some of them they discounted, but the Catholic Church has validated many claims of people who've claimed to have had a vision of the Virgin Mary. Again, I don't think anyone assumes that they actually saw Mary from 2,000 years ago have come back to life and they saw her physical body. But they're having a vision of Mary. And the reality is that in the population, there are estimates that up to 15% of people in general have a vision of a family member or close friend who has passed away. And it's not uncommon for people to report that they had a vision, that they saw their father or mother who just passed away. So these kind of experiences are not that unusual, and it seems that that's exactly what Paul had. And once we understand that that's what Paul experienced, then other parts of Paul's story become much more understandable. For example, Paul mentions absolutely nothing about an empty tomb. Now, that's a very, very important part of what the evangelists, what the gospel writers report. To them, it's an incredible piece of evidence that people went to the tomb and it was empty. Paul doesn't report anything about it. He doesn't know about it. And it would seem that because from Paul's point of view, it's quite probable that Jesus was buried and he remained in the grave and his body decomposed, but people are going to see this risen Jesus, this spiritual body of Jesus, not the physical body that's come back to life. And it's interesting that Paul, as opposed to the other gospel writers, Paul never mentions anyone having a bodily experience, having some kind of encounter with a bodily risen Jesus, with a flesh and bones Jesus. And that's significant because we know that about 3 years after Paul has his personal experience, he goes to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles. He goes to meet with James and with Peter and with John and to basically have his first meeting with them. And presumably, they knew that Paul had never met Jesus. And they were allegedly the eyewitnesses to what happened after the crucifixion. So if it was true that Jesus really appeared to them bodily, if the disciples had met and encountered the body of Jesus risen from the grave, they would obviously have told that to Paul. That would have been an important thing for Paul to know. And yet Paul never writes about any kind of encounter that anyone has with Jesus on a physical level. Now, I just wanted to mention one more thing before I moved on to the next witness, which is it's interesting that the church in its tradition never passed on any tradition about where Jesus was seen. Now, if what happened was that Jesus actually rose from the dead bodily, and there was a Jesus who'd come back, flesh and bones, and you could touch him and see him and really know that you're with the old Jesus that just died 3 days ago and's come back to life. If that really happened, that would have been amazing. That would have been incredible. And it's impossible to imagine that they would not remember where that happened, meaning that people would probably remember that spot or those spots and say, this is where we actually saw Jesus who came back from the dead. And these spots probably would have become shrines or holy places. But it's interesting, the church never preserved any history, any tradition of any place where Jesus was supposed to have appeared to his disciples in a bodily form, which gives us more reason to understand that all the appearances of Jesus were not physical, but they were these visionary experiences. So after Paul, the next writer really is Mark, who's writing around the year 70. And here we find, I think, the most clear evidence that the stories of the resurrection were embellished. Because when you look at the original manuscripts of Mark, they end in chapter 16, verse 8. Almost all editions of the New Testament today will have a notation saying that the original manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts, end with verse 8 in chapter 16. Now, the reason that's significant is because the way the original version of the Gospel of Mark ends is with the women coming to the tomb, and they're told by someone that Jesus has risen and that the disciples should meet him in the Galilee. But then it says that the women were terrified and they didn't tell anyone. And that's how the story ends. And it's significant that there are no appearances, any kind of appearances. There are no appearances in Mark's gospel of Jesus to anyone. Now, what we see is that this was incredibly embarrassing and disturbing to the church. The church couldn't let it sit like that. You know, how could it be that, you know, the earliest gospel doesn't mention the appearances of Jesus? That's very, very problematic. So about 300 years after the original Mark was written, someone basically took pieces of Matthew, of Luke, and John, and put together a better ending, right? A more improved ending for the Gospel of Mark. You know, it shows you that when you're reading the Gospel accounts, you're not reading history. You're reading a rewrite of history. You're reading a embellishment of history in order to create the kind of story that the church wants us to hear, not what happened. So when people read their, you know, book of Mark, it goes to verse 20 usually. It goes to Mark chapter 16, verse 20, and people assume, yeah, that's what happened. Jesus came out of the grave and he appeared to people, but that's not the original story in Mark, which is the earliest gospel. Some Christians will insist that that was actually always, those last verses from verse 9 to 20 were always part of Mark's gospel, but they were lost. The original was lost, but it was always there. This is problematic for many reasons. Number one, 2,000 years ago, they didn't have books where the last page could fall out. They wrote on scrolls back then, and so it's not the kind of thing where the last part of the scroll is going to fall out. Also, this last verses from 9 to 20 don't appear in any of the oldest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark. Also, it's interesting that the church fathers in the early 3rd century, none of them were aware of these verses at the end of Mark. And also the language, the vocabulary in these last verses from 9 to 20, and the style of writing is totally different than the rest of the book of Mark. So what we see is that many years later, someone just they concocted their own ending that they thought was more appropriate to have for the book of Mark. Basically, from my perspective, this speaks volumes in terms of whether or not we can take the Gospels without a big grain of salt. The third testimony is from Matthew, who's composed around the year 80. And Matthew also, embellishes the story with a lot of supernatural stuff going on. He has the angel coming down and the earthquake, which no one else reports. But here, what Matthew says, which is different than Paul and different than, not different than Paul, I'm sorry. Matthew just claims that on a mountain in the Galilee, Jesus appears to his disciples. And that's all he says. And it seems that that's also a visionary experience, because especially Matthew tells us that some of the disciples doubted. It wasn't so clear to them that they were seeing Jesus. Now, what changes dramatically, and this is really the main point I would like to make tonight, is that the later sources, which means Luke and John, these Gospels get massaged and pumped up to solidify these visionary experiences into actual encounters with a physical flesh and bones Jesus. That's very clearly what happens in the later Gospels. So, for example, in Luke's Gospel, written around the year 90, you have Jesus eating bread and fish with the disciples. Now, that doesn't happen usually in a vision. It's very hard to imagine people having a vision of someone and then sitting down and eating and having bread and fish with the vision that they're having. That's not usually what happens in a vision. Although, if you read a lot of the reports of people that claim to have been abducted by aliens, I don't want to compare these topics, but it's interesting that you have literally hundreds of reports today by people who claim that they were kidnapped by aliens and then surgery was done on them. So people, it's possible people do have visionary experiences where they physically interact with the vision that they're having, but it's usually not with a group of people. It's usually with an individual. So in Luke's Gospel, you have all the disciples are sitting around with Jesus and eating fish and bread. And in John's Gospel, it goes one step further. John, written around the year 100, has the doubting Thomas actually put his finger into the wound in Jesus' side that Jesus incurred when the Roman soldier thrust a spear into his side. And so that you don't get more sort of tactile than that, for people to know this really is Jesus. And I think what's going on here is that the earlier Gospels, Paul's testimony and Mark and Matthew, leave open the possibility that it was just a hallucination. And I think that the later Gospel writers were concerned. They really wanted to sort of refute that counterclaim. They wanted to make it clear from their point of view that no, it wasn't a visionary experience. It wasn't just something people imagined or they had a vision of some spiritual thing that you can't touch. Luke and John want to basically make it a resurrection which is totally physical, where the body of Jesus, wounds and all, comes out of the grave, comes back to life, is revivified, and then people can actually see him, touch him, eat with him. They really want to make that as solid as possible. And so I think that what we see when we go through the New Testament accounts of the resurrection, it basically develops over the course of about 50 years in a way which has become, in the understanding, I think, of most Christians, what they assume happened. Now, it's interesting that a number of years ago, the Barna group, which is an evangelical polling organization, they polled evangelical Christians and found, I think it was about 30% of evangelicals don't really believe that Jesus rose bodily from the grave. Now, what I'd like to do before we sort of wrap up for tonight is just address a couple of arguments that apologists put forward to support the resurrection story. One is they ask the question that if Jesus really didn't rise from the grave. So why didn't any of his opponents produce his body? That's often raised, right? That if Jewish people really thought that Jesus was not resurrected, so they could have gone to his grave and they could have, said, look, here he is. So there are two things to bear in mind. Number one, that the original belief, as we just saw tonight, was not that Jesus rose from the grave. The original belief that people thought happened was that Jesus was still in the grave, but that they had seen him. There were appearances. People had a vision of Jesus, and so there'd be no need to go dig up the grave. It wouldn't have made a difference. Even according to the later accounts, where they claim that Jesus did bodily rise from the grave, so you have to realize that the disciples did not publicly begin preaching their belief in the resurrection until 50 days after the crucifixion. Now, this is not talking about, December time in Alaska. We're talking here about summertime in Israel, where it was very hot. And after 50 days, any body would have decomposed beyond recognition. So it really wouldn't have helped, even if people could have found the tomb. And what I would suggest is that probably the most plausible scenario is that Joseph of Arimathea, he wanted to very hastily bury the body of Jesus temporarily because the Shabbat was about to begin. And so he doesn't have time to properly prepare Jesus's body for burial. Back then they would have to wash the body, that was customary, and they would have special burial shrouds, and they would anoint the body with oil and with spices so it wouldn't smell as bad as it was decomposing. They didn't have time to do that before Shabbat began. So I think what's plausible is that Joseph of Arimathea just quickly buried Jesus in a temporary place, and his plan was after Shabbat sometime, or even on Shabbat. It's even according to Jewish law, to bury someone, it may be possible to do certain things on Shabbat. So he may have had plans to come back a little bit later and remove the body from the temporary tomb and then properly prepare it for burial and then reinter it somewhere else. So it's possible that Joseph of Arimathea did that, or someone else took the body out. And so even if people were going to try and find the body of Jesus in the tomb, it's no guarantee that he would have been there. The most popular defense of the resurrection is the claim, it's a psychological defense. The defense goes like this. They say that the followers of Jesus were totally defeated after his crucifixion. And something dramatic, therefore, must have happened to transform them into a group of bold evangelists who would go around proclaiming their faith in Jesus. And so the argument is it must have been the resurrection, meaning what else could have transformed this group of defeated, broken men who were disappointed that their Messiah was killed, other than the fact that he had come back to life? A similar sort of take on this is the argument that people might be willing to die for a belief that's not true, but people would not be willing to die for a belief that they themselves made up and knew wasn't true. So this tries to explain that it's impossible to suggest that the apostles made up the story of the resurrection, because they would have known it wasn't true, and they would never have gone to their deaths for the belief in the resurrection.
Interesting.
So there are a number of things to understand. Number one, there's this idea that the disciples went to their deaths for their belief in the resurrection is simply not true. There's no historical proof at all that this happened. There's just no evidence that his followers went to their deaths. There's a woman who wrote a book in 2013, I believe, Dr. Candida Moss, who's a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame. Her book is called The Myth of Persecution: How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. And she goes through basically the historical evidence to show that this really was not the case, that there really weren't followers of Jesus who died specifically for their beliefs. Also, it's important to remember that the belief in the resurrection at first was, it's not that the belief in the resurrection is what created the devotion to Jesus. That's often what's argued, that it must have been the resurrection that created their tremendous devotion to Jesus. It really was the other way around. It was the tremendous devotion these people had to Jesus that created the whole story of the resurrection. We saw that before, that cognitive dissonance will basically say that if people have a strong belief in something, they will do what it takes. They'll come up with some way of maintaining that belief, even in the face of disconfirmation. So given the fact that the disciples were so devoted to Jesus, it's really hard to imagine that a story like the resurrection would not have come up. Also, we should remember that the original belief was not that Jesus rose from the grave bodily, but that they claimed to have had visionary experiences. So they're not necessarily fabricating these experiences. You know, when people believe that they had a vision, they're not lying. They're not, they're not creating a lie. It's something they really believe happened. And so even if people went to their deaths, they're not going to their deaths, in the face of a lie that they created. They're going into their deaths, if they do go to their deaths, to, live according to a vision that they believe happened. Now, when we think about the Christian scriptures, they speak about only two martyrs. One is Stephen in chapter 7 of the book of Acts. And Stephen never really was a follower of Jesus. Stephen was a later convert. So Stephen himself never experienced the resurrection. He only heard about it from others. So he wasn't someone who made up a belief. He's someone that simply accepted the belief of others. And we don't have any evidence that Stephen was crucified for his belief in the resurrection. It seems from Acts that he was crucified for other reasons. And there was never any indication that he was given a chance to recant, meaning that we don't have any indication that Stephen or any of the followers were told, if you will deny your belief in the resurrection, we'll let you live. So there's no proof that anyone went to their death for their belief in the resurrection. The same thing is with the story of the Apostle James, by the way. He was also martyred, we're told, but we don't have any evidence as to why he was murdered. And we're never given any indication that he could have saved himself by denying his belief in the resurrection. So these arguments they sound good, but they're fallacious. So question is this, I'd like to wrap up with this now. If Jesus was resurrected, if it happened, what would it prove? Would it prove anything? So let's think about whether the resurrection of Jesus would prove that he was the Messiah. So the truth is, the Bible never gave the resurrection as a criteria for what the Messiah is or how we'll be able to recognize the Messiah. Right? We saw that the Bible gives a very clear way of knowing who the Messiah is. He's going to be the Davidic king that will reign when all of the prophecies that were uttered by the prophets about the Messianic age have come true. So when there will be a descendant of David who will lead the Jewish people through that process we described, where they return to God and they come back to their land and the temple's rebuilt and they are able to serve as the teachers to the world and lead the world to universal knowledge of God and peace, then you'll know he's the Messiah. The Bible never says you'll know someone's the Messiah because they'll come back from the dead. And also we know, we've discussed this in the past, that miracles in the Bible don't prove anything. Deuteronomy 13 tells us that even false prophets can do miracles, and Matthew 24, not long ago we read, says in verse 24 that even false messiahs can do incredible supernatural miracles. Would a resurrection prove that someone is God? Well, that's obviously not the case. Even in the book of Acts, by the way it reports the resurrection is that God raised Jesus from the dead. So it wouldn't prove that Jesus was God. It would just be another miracle that God did. We know that in the Jewish scriptures, there are several resurrections. We know that Elisha the prophet and Elijah the prophet were able to bring people back from the dead through the power of God. It didn't prove these people were God or that these prophets were God. It just simply proved that God was able to do miracles. And in the New Testament, there are also many other stories of resurrections. No one would suggest that those people brought back from the dead were God or divine. So the one thought I'd like to conclude with is this. Christianity insists that belief in the resurrection is critical for our salvation. No one's sins will be forgiven. No one will be able to go to heaven or have eternal life without the resurrection happening and without believing in it. Now, there's a famous polemicist today who actually has debated Christians about the resurrection. His name is Richard Carrier. And he wrote, I think, something that's quite appropriate in this regard. Because again, the New Testament and Christianity demand total commitment to this fact of the resurrection and belief that it happened. So Carrier says that no wise or compassionate God would demand this from us. Such a God would not leave us so poorly informed about something so important. If we have a message for someone that is urgently vital for their survival, and we have any compassion, that compassion will compel us to communicate that message as clearly as possible and with every necessary proof, not ambiguously and through unreliable mediaries presenting no real evidence. So that, I believe, is really the major problem here. That, when you compare the resurrection, where Jesus allegedly appears to a few people, and it's not even a clear appearance, it's more of a visionary appearance. Compare that to the foundational event in Judaism, which was the event surrounding the Exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Mount Sinai. Here you had something experienced clearly by 3 million people. And so I think that the strength of this claim of the resurrection, when we put it into a full context, it really does not stand up to a strong scrutiny. Now, there's a lot more to say on this topic. It's actually a huge topic, and I think, though, that as a brief overview, I think that should suffice.
That was awesomely deep and very informative.
Okay.
Well, you know what? As awesome as this has been, lingering through the book of Matthew, I can't tell you how excited I am to move on. So any idea what our future plans are for the next project, sir?
So I think in the next few days, I'm going to decide whether we're going to go through the Gospel of John, because most Christian scholars look at the first 3 Gospels as what they call the synoptic Gospels. That means that they're seen through one view, because they basically more or less, Matthew and Luke basically contain all of Mark, and they're not great significant changes. I mean, there is some changes, but I'm not sure it's worth our time to go through all of Mark or all of Luke. But John is significantly different than the synoptic Gospels. So either we will pick up with John chapter 1, or if I feel that we've done enough of the life of Jesus, we'll head right over to Acts chapter 1.
Nice. And start chipping away at Paul.
Well, Acts is still written by Luke.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. We can introduce Paul later on. So that's interesting. All right. Well, Rabbi, it's been fun as usual. Folks, be sure to follow Rabbi Skobac around his Canadian cold website and definitely go there to support him too. I mean, he's a very busy man, and just like everybody who's got their life dedicated to teaching, they could always use the extra bump. So you can go there and find a little donate tab at his website. I'm sure follow him on JewsForJudaism.ca, and also on the YouTube channels as well. You can also subscribe to Tanakh Talk YouTube channel and get the whatever it is that my YouTube channel gives you whenever I post things. So until next week, Rabbi, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again. And everybody else, Shavua Tov, everyone.
Have a great week.
Thank you.
כל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה